Welcome to the Plane Guys. I'm Jeffrey Thomas. I'm joined by Richard Godfrey in Germany. Good morning, Richard.
Good afternoon, Jeffrey.
Yeah, and today we're going to look at a terrible, tragic crash, that of the Air New Zealand DC-10, 1979, flight number TE901. And we've labeled this particular episode a litany of lies. So on November 28, 1979, a sightseeing flight over Antarctica turned into one of the deadliest disasters in New Zealand's history. Air New Zealand flight TE901 and McDonnell Douglas DC-10 crashed into Mount Erebus on Ross Island, killing all 257 people on board. This tragedy not only left a deep scar on the nation's collective memory, but also raised important questions about airline operations, accountability, and the limits of human error. So, Richard, let's look at what happened and why.
Jeffrey, you've followed this tragedy closely over the years. Let's start as usual with the background to this sightseeing trip over Antarctica.
Yeah, so it wasn't a standard commercial route, but a popular scenic flight operated by Air New Zealand. They launched these flights in 1977. These flights took passengers from Auckland to the Ross Ice Shelf and back, giving them breathtaking aerial views of Antarctica. The aircraft would typically descend to as low as 2,000 feet to give passengers better views of landmarks like Mount Erebus and McMurdo Sound. On the morning of November 28, 1979, 237 passengers and 20 crew members boarded the DC-10 in Auckland, expecting a once-in-a-lifetime experience. Tragically, none would return.
So, what were the crash details?
So the DC-10, Richard, crashed on the lower slopes of Mount Erebus, a 12,448-foot active volcano on Ross Island. The impact occurred at 12:49 p.m. New Zealand Daylight Time, killing, as I mentioned, all 257 people instantly. The weather conditions in the area included low cloud and whiteout. And that's a phenomenon where the snow and the sky blend, eliminating any visual references at all. It's quite an extraordinary thing to see. The type of accident was classified as a controlled flight into terrain, CFIT, meaning the aircraft was flying normally under control but inadvertently crashed into the ground. The crew had no idea they were heading towards the mountain until the final seconds of the flight.
A controlled flight into terrain. That sounds ominous. So, why was that, Jeffrey?
One of the most significant contributing factors, Richard, was a last minute uncommunicated change to the aircraft's flight path. The flight crew believed they were following a route over McMurdo Sound, a relatively flat and safe area. However, unbeknown to them, the navigation coordinates in the aircraft's flight management system had been altered the night before the flight without notifying the crew. Now, it gets more complicated than that, so bear with me. In 1978, it was decided to computerize the waypoints for the Antarctic flights. Chief Navigator of Air New Zealand, Brian Hewitt, however, entered the coordinate for the ice runway, which was known at the time as Williams Field, of a longitude of 166.48 instead of the NDB of 166.41, which would have only been a slight error. But he didn't enter 166.48. He entered 164.48. That sent the route down McMurdo Sound, which is what all the publicity material was based on. These mistakes lay in the computer for 14 months. 2 weeks before TE901, a Captain Simpson operates a sightseeing flight down there and notes the error, as he appears to be the only pilot who actually plotted the waypoint on a map. On return, he tells the navigation department there is something wrong with the waypoint. Brian Hewitt then updated the waypoint, not realizing the original waypoint was 27 nautical miles out. He thought he was just updating it from the NDB waypoint to the TACAN, just 2.7 nautical miles. Thus, he reasoned there was no need to notify the crew of the next flight. The approved track was in fact to the TACAN south of Mount Erebus, and the aircraft would have to fly 13,000 feet to avoid the 12,440 foot active volcano. But they would know that the waypoint was in fact just beyond Mount Erebus, so they would know they would have to stay up at 13,000 feet and above. The flight plan presented at the briefing corresponded to the track down McMurdo Sound, giving Mount Erebus a wide berth to the east, whereas the flight plan printed on the morning of the flight corresponded to a track that coincided with Mount Erebus, which would result in the tragic collision if this flight was flown at an altitude less than 13,000 feet. Now, Richard, you have read the report in more detail, and there are some more dynamics to consider.
Yeah, the final report, 3,083 pages long. There are several dynamics. The role of the then Prime Minister Robert Muldoon and his government, the fact that the Air New Zealand airline was majority government owned, and there is a long history going back. In 1923, the New Zealand laid a claim to a certain territory in the Antarctic, but the US never recognized that claim. Uh, Fortunately, today, the US McMurdo Station and the New Zealand Scott base, which are only 3 kilometers apart in the New Zealand Antarctic territory, they share the same airfield and logistics, and they have a great cooperation. Now, you mentioned Jeffrey, but he didn't enter 166.48. He entered 164.48. And that's true, but actually there are four different coordinates which were used over the 14-month period that you point out. And if the aircraft had actually followed 164.48, it would have been safe. But
Mm,
the fact is that the printout given to Captain Collins showed 166 degrees 58 minutes east. And that flight plan was what caused the disaster. As you say, it flew directly into Mount Erebus. And it is not just a litany of lies. It's you could call it concealment, shadowy, undocumented explanations, an orchestrated litany of lies, half-truths, obfuscation, and denial. And this comes out in detail in the Mahan findings. When someone wants to read it up, section 247 and section 248. And I quote from the final summary, deliberately designed to conceal from the United States authorities that the flight path had been changed, and probably because it was known that the United States Air Traffic Control, which was on McMurdo Station, would lodge an objection to the new flight path.
mm,
So,
yeah.
coming back to the circumstances, you mentioned whiteout conditions and the optical illusion that seemed to play a critical part.
Look, it did, and the phenomenon known as sector whiteout played a devastating role in Antarctica. The conditions, the snow-covered surfaces and cloud cover can blend seamlessly, making it nearly impossible to distinguish the ground from the sky. This illusion caused the flight crew to believe they were flying over flat terrain when they were in fact headed directly towards a 12,000-foot volcano. The pilots, Captain Jim Collins and First Officer Greg Casson, had no visual warning whatsoever until the very last seconds when the collision warnings went off and they tried to climb it, and they were just way too late and they slammed into the side of the volcano. The devastation was just total. It was just a ghastly sight. It really was.
So, Captain Jim Collins and First Officer Greg Casson, this was the first time they were pilots on one of these Antarctic flights, was it not?
Yes, they were very experienced, but neither had flown to the Antarctic. And a year or so earlier, uh, there was a requirement that the captain of the next flight would go down on a visual flight and just observe the whole operation. So you'd have that experience. Yes, I've been down here before. I'm now commanding a flight. But that condition was removed, endorsed by the New Zealand regulator. And so neither of them had been down to the Antarctic before. So this again added to the danger, if you like, of this particular type of operation.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, Jeffrey. The Justice Martin went down to the Antarctic himself as part of his
Mm.
investigation and was actually shown and experienced the whiteout conditions so he could better understand that, which I think was very useful that he should do that.
Yeah.
So the first investigation, however, blamed the pilots, did it not?
Yes, indeed. In the immediate aftermath, New Zealand's Chief Inspector of Air Accidents, Ron Chippendale, conducted an investigation, and his report was released in 1980, and it attributed the crash to pilot error. It stated the flight crew had descended below minimum safe altitude and failed to properly monitor their instruments. The conclusion drew very harsh criticism from the public, the media, including an aviation reporter colleague of mine, and some other aviation experts. And many believed it unfairly blamed the crew without adequately exploring systematic failures within Air New Zealand's operations.
Yeah, and then came the Royal Commission and the Mahan report. Can you tell us how that came about and what the findings were?
Well, yes, the controversy was massive in New Zealand, and there was lots of lobbying of the government, and the Prime Minister Muldoon was forced to commission a Royal Commission of Inquiry, and it was led by Justice Peter Mahon, one of the most highly respected High Court judges in New Zealand, an absolutely outstanding individual. And his 1981 report painted a very, very different picture, as we've already outlined. He concluded that the crash was caused primarily by the unnotified change of the flight path, and Mahon famously accused Air New Zealand executives of orchestrating an orchestrated litany of lies to cover up the airline's responsibility. He stated the evidence had been deliberately withheld and the pilots had been unfairly blamed for an error they could not have possibly anticipated. Although Mahn's findings were legally challenged and partially overturned on procedural grounds, his report remains a landmark document in aviation accountability and was tabled, in fact, by the Minister of Transport, Maurice Williamson. He was the incoming Minister for Transport in a new government in 1999, and that became the official account of TE 901. And just a little sidelight to that, uh, he tabled the report in Parliament, and in the gallery were Justice Mahn's wife, because Justice Mahn had passed away, and the wives of the captain, co-pilot, and engineer of that flight. They were in the gallery when that report was tabled. A very emotional, very, very emotional moment.
Yeah, I can imagine. And I mean, 3,083 pages. Justice Mann did a fantastic job
Mm.
and very complicated and confusing statements from various people. I think he even involved one of the pilots who did a independent investigation as an advisor on his inquiry, and
Gordon Vetty.
yeah, and I think
Yep,
quite frankly, without all of these various individuals pushing for this Royal Commission and the what Justice Mahan finally reported on, we would still be in the dark today, wouldn't we?
definitely. No, he did an outstanding job. And viewers, there's a tremendous documentary about this terrible crash, and the link to that YouTube documentary, it's on YouTube, are in the description below, and I do recommend it. It's about an hour and a half long, but it's well worth watching. It's very powerful.
So, what was the impact on Air New Zealand and New Zealand aviation?
Well, it had lasting repercussions for Air New Zealand. I mean, their reputation was shattered by it all. Um, and it suffered for years. It ceased the Antarctic sightseeing flights. Changes were also made in the flight path management, crew communication protocols, and accident investigation procedures. On a broader level, the crash prompted reforms on how flight data is stored, assessed, and changed, emphasising the need for traceability and transparency in airline operations. And I should note very strongly that Air New Zealand today does not resemble in any way, shape, or form the Air New Zealand of 1979. Today, it's just simply industry best practice from an operation and pilot perspective, as well as other areas like marketing and passenger comfort and service. So it's a very different operation completely.
Yeah, well, it's a it's a good job, isn't it? Because
Mm.
it's a horrific story, and there was a horrific human cost and national grief attached to this horrific
Yes,
story.
indeed, Richard. It claimed 257 lives, as we've said. Passengers from New Zealand, Japan, the United States, the United Kingdom, and some other countries. Entire families were lost, and communities across New Zealand were just left devastated. The scale of the loss stunned the nation, which had never experienced a peacetime disaster of such magnitude. Um, in the decades since the crash, efforts to remember the victims have been taken in many forms. A memorial was established at Scott Base in Antarctica, and another one on the slopes of Mount Erebus. In Auckland, the Erebus National Memorial is under development to honour those lost. And then there's also a memorial in the forecourt at Air New Zealand's headquarters. And Air New Zealand actually chartered a New Zealand Air Force 757, and I think it's on two occasions, and actually flew relatives down to Mount Erebus uh, to remember the terrible tragedy. So they've made quite a lot of effort to really um, remember this terrible tragedy and to honour those that were lost.
So, what's your conclusion out of this tragedy, then, Jeffrey?
The crash for me of 901 was not merely a tragic accident, it was a confluence of human error, environmental factors, and corporate mismanagement. The fact that the pilots were unaware of the navigation change sealed the fate of 257 people, even as they followed procedures they believed were safe. So it's a real lesson in human factors, and I think a lot was learned from this. And Richard, you had some lessons related to MH370 on this as well.
Yeah, I particularly would add to your list the transparency and communication procedures. They didn't inform the pilot and the crew, but they also didn't inform ATC at McMurdo Station. And that
Mm,
lack of communication and transparency is unbelievable. Yeah, so you asked, what do we learn out of this for MH370? Well, I think the number one lesson is that we need a better oversight of airlines like Malaysia Airlines, which are 100% government owned. Air New Zealand was at the time majority owned by the New Zealand government. There are, in fact, 74 airlines which are 100% owned by the governments of 63 different countries. And it then, in my mind, begs the uh, requirement for the ICAO to have a particularly improved oversight of government owned airlines. Another lesson for me back in 2016, I wrote a paper with Victor Unello entitled MH370 Path Towards McMurdo Station. And it is fascinating to observe that the flight simulator coordinates on Captain Sahari Shah's home flight simulator, when you line them up, eventually reach McMurdo Station. And, you think whether the Erebus disaster was on his mind during his planning
mm.
on his flight simulator. And I think finally, I would mention that there are a number of analysts, including a former airline captain and other experts using different pseudonyms like T-Bill, or one was Lieutenant Commander Lucas Mangosteen, retired, which obviously is not a relatively exotic pseudonym. But the point is, they mention and clearly bring to light the Kuala Lumpur to Amsterdam flight, which Captain Sahari had recently flown, is a flight with a range of 5,529 nautical miles. And Kuala Lumpur to McMurdo is 5,240 nautical miles. Now, I'm not saying that is evidence of anything other than the possibility uh, that the range of a Boeing 777 from Kuala Lumpur could have reached even down to McMurdo. So, one thing, the flight simulator lines up with McMurdo. It's a completely different thing when you raise the possibility of a diversion of an Amsterdam flight, which was, I think, discounted because there are two sets of crew on board an Amsterdam flight and not just one co-pilot to get out of the cockpit. So I don't want to speculate any further on that, but it is important when investigating MH370 to take into consideration what a pilot would have known. And he would have perhaps even read the books on the Erebus crash, and that could have set him thinking.
Yeah, and just for the viewers, that 5,240 nautical miles would include the up the Malacca Strait, Andaman Sea, and down the West Australian coast, and then across to McMurdo Sound. It wouldn't be flying over Australia.
Yep, that's correct.
Mm,
So
mm,
he could have taken his home flight simulator path right through to McMurdo, is all I'm trying to say there.
mm. But yeah, look, this is an incredible story, Richard, and an amazing story, incredible tragedy. and a whole bunch of things that conspired to end 257 lives.
Yeah, I had to read several parts of the Mann report um, over and over again because I couldn't believe what I was reading. And it is people at the time were so confused that you can read the report and it appears to confuse just about everybody else trying to
Mm,
investigate.
mm.
It's not easy to sort out fact from fiction in this one. Um,
And
but
that comes out in this documentary too. Everybody is sort of like, what is going on here? And that particular thing you mentioned does really come out in this documentary, which the viewers can watch, link below.
yeah, I've watched it myself. It's great.
Mm. So, listeners and viewers, thank you very much indeed for joining in. Thank you, Richard, for joining us today. And then tomorrow we're going to be looking at your questions. So send us some questions on this particular episode. There's quite a few MH370 questions that we've got to get to as well. So we'll pick a selection and we'll be back with you tomorrow. So thank you for watching. Please subscribe. Please like us. Please send those more comments in. They're fantastic. And thank you for the support. And we'll see you tomorrow. Thank you.